All right. So before we get back into lesson 11 this evening, we're going to finish it. We got about halfway done through lesson 11. We'll finish that up tonight. I saw this article posted on my, all this, it's funny, Google, it kind of tries to learn your tendencies and stuff. And now all of a sudden I'm getting bombarded with all these evolutionary articles and stuff in my Google feed. I'm like, oh, great. But one of these stood out to me, and it says, this is a Earth.com article that was posted a couple of days ago. 520 million year old fossil discovered with brains and guts still intact, stunning the lead scientist. Now, you remember what Josh was talking about, what was it, last chapter, or earlier this chapter, in the geologic column? At what point do we see life just all of a sudden explode? They call it the what explosion? The Cambrian explosion. Okay, notice this is a Cambrian fossil. Supposedly, was an age of experimentation. Life in the seas was trying out every possible body plan, searching for combinations that worked, which I thought was kind of funny that it includes that. But then, here's the reaction of the lead scientist when he discovered that there's still guts and organs and stuff. He said, I already knew that this simple worm-like fossil was something special, but when I saw the amazing structures preserved under its skin, my jaw just dropped. How could these intricate features have avoided decay and still be here to see 500 million years later? Strange, isn't it? Just yet another in a string of examples of evidence that it shouldn't exist. That should not be there. And yet it is. And the lead scientist is just shocked that he was able to find that. Okay, so last week we ended talking about we have all these hundreds of billions of fish fossils and vertebrate fossils and things like that that are found in different places all over the world, all in the same area, especially areas where geologically after the flood there may have been kind of a bowl, like a valley or something, where the water would have just kind of accumulated and all these animals would have kind of been washed into one area. And we see that a lot. But as far as human fossils that would have come at that point, why don't we find human fossils in what's called the Cambrian explosion, or in that, that age where the flood would have been? It's not that they're not there. They're very likely they are. But as we talked about last week, one fossil, because if you just, again, estimate, we don't know for sure, but 10 million people lived before the flood, you would find one human fossil every 33.5 cubic miles. And to put that into perspective, this is 1 cubic mile. That's a single cubic mile. Cubic isn't a square mile, it's up, down, and around. It's a cube. That's the Golden Gate Bridge. And to put that into perspective, this little small cube, that's just 100 meters on every edge. It could hold 1 million tons of water or other material. That's 1 cubic mile. You'd have to have 33 and a half of those, not one skeleton, one bone, one fossil of a bone, and to be possibly to find it. Now, it's also entirely possible that some have been found, but have been misappropriated. Remember, a lot of these, when we talk about the fossil gap, not transitional fossils and the DNA gap or the transitional fossil gap, things like that. We're just talking about the fossil record gap, which is to say that a lot of creatures that we see pictures of, that are artist renditions, are based on either one single or a fragmentary bone fossil, like a pinky finger or a piece of a vertebrae, something like that. And so keep in mind, a lot of these fossils could very well be misapplied, misindexed as being something that it isn't. And that's something actually in chapter 12, Josh delves a little bit more into, especially as it pertains to human fossils versus quote unquote ape fossils and things like that. So one of the things he points out is just because something looks old doesn't mean that it is. We talked a little bit about this in a couple chapters ago, how that God, when he created everything, he created it mature. Okay, he told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. Okay, that was after they were kicked out of the garden. But you have Adam and Eve being fully mature. You have the animals being fully mature. You have trees with fruit on them. It's not like Adam and Eve were starving for the first month or two in the garden. There was already fruit on the trees, and so there's no problem there in terms of if we believe in an almighty God, could God have simply created everything to look as if it is that age? Well, sure. So then, by what standard do you determine what old is? We talked about radiometric dating, even if it were absolutely accurate, meaning in terms of the physical world, okay, all the math says and all the science says that the world is 4.5 billion years old. Okay. Could it still only be 7,000 years old and God created it to be about 4.5 billion years old? Sure. And I have no problem with that. Again, we have radiometric dating issues all over the place. But even if it were completely accurate, no issues at all, that doesn't change anything. In fact, Josh even brings up Job 38, where after Job, the sin that Job committed, for which he repents in Job chapter 40, remember he repents in ashes, the only sin that he committed was questioning the wisdom of God in allowing a righteous person such as Job to suffer the way that he did. And part of Job's point was, everybody else is seeing this and the fact that I serve you, and to them you're dealing with me unjustly because I'm a righteous person. And God then, instead of addressing his friends, which some of his friends, they were, completely way off on some things, but then God addresses Job starting in chapter 38. And he says, where were you when I created the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I created Leviathan? Where were you when I created this and that? And all of it leads to chapter 40 for him to say, I have looked into things and asked things which I have no right to ask. I have no need to ask those things because my wisdom is nothing compared to God's wisdom. And the whole point of that is to show that God has his ways and his means and his thoughts that are far beyond our ability to comprehend. We have our little sliver of perspective on things, and we can see maybe certain cause and effects for allowing certain things to happen or not allowing other things to happen. But in the end, do we see the big picture? No, we can't possibly see the big picture. Just a single individual's life. How many people, can you count how many people you've either talked to, had an emotional impact, had a strong relationship with, somebody who you've been able to, even just in passing, maybe somebody overhearing a conversation you've had with a coworker or a friend or a family member? You can't possibly know how many different people over the course of your life you've impacted and that God has utilized through his providence to bring about a change perhaps in somebody. And you may never know it. In fact, I won't tell the story here, but there was years and years, and he never ever helped save one soul from that. And that was something that stuck with him the rest of his life. So you just never know. He talks a little bit about out-of-place fossils and things that seemingly look older than what they are. And this is one example of multiples. In fact, I was telling the teenagers, this is actually, I'm very aware of this particular fossil because this is used by the ancient alien theorists to talk about how ancient aliens existed 500 million years ago. Because obviously humans didn't make this because it's 500 million years old. This is 135 million. This is rock that has been dated to 135 million years. It was from London, Texas. Some of you may know where that's at. I don't. But does that look like alien technology to you? At least not the alien technology I'm used to. Okay. Obviously, that's not what happened. Okay, there was a miner probably in the 1800s, probably the 1800s, who probably left it laying around, and a geologic process took place in which this sediment kind of formed and created this. And we have the examples like this all over the place, stalactites and things like that. There's two different terms for that. There's one that comes down from the bottom of a cave and one that comes up, stalactite and stalagmite, something like that. Stalagmite, thank you. And supposedly it takes, so many hundreds of thousands of years for a certain amount of growth in these different formations. And yet we see caves that have just been excavated, or caves that have been created just in the last, couple hundred years, start having these things far faster. Oh, well, those are very unique situations. Are they? But again, this is one example where obviously that is not a 135 million year old hammer created by aliens. It's probably 200 years old. All right. Talk a little bit about Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens had a huge impact on the geology field, on the field really even of paleontology, given kind of what they've found in the geology of Mount St. Helens. But it created 25-foot sediment just in hours. And so imagine what a worldwide flood could do. The world was completely covered. If you go back to Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, as well as chapter 8, verse 4, yes, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and during that period, the water came up, and the world was flooded during those 40 days. But after the rain stopped, and after God allowed the waters to erupt from below, remember it says we're told that the fountains of the deep were broken open. And of course, we talked about how there's at least three times more water underneath the surface of the earth than above it. But it took 6 months for the tops of the mountains to get out and start repopulating the earth for over 12 months, about 12 months and a week, we see in chapter 8, verse 14. So over a year. And that's when all of the waters of the earth, at least the flood waters of the earth, were completely dried up at that point. And it's at that point Noah is allowed to leave and be able to let all the animals start to repopulate. So he was actually on the top of the mountain, kind of stuck there with the ark for something like 4 months or so, which is interesting. Kind of put that into perspective a little bit. So he talks a little bit about, in fact, he gives a picture of examples of sedimentary layers that are embedded in one another. And there is no explanation as to why certain places you have what's supposed to be strata that is separated by hundreds of millions of years embedded within each other. There's just no explanation for that, at least from the geologic perspective, and yet it exists. Well, why would that be? You have multiple examples that contradict, but we've been talking about uniformitarianism, the idea that sediment would grow at a certain pace, and it has been for millions and millions and millions of years. You have fossilized trees that are standing straight up through millions and millions of years of sediment. Did that tree just survive all the way through those millions of years? Well, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. You have a baleen well that he talked about, 75 feet long, and it's almost standing on its tail. It's at about a 60-degree angle, and it's through multiple strata layers. How in the world would that have happened? It had to have been caught as it's trying to swim up or away from something, and it got caught in all the sediment. You have dinosaur remains that have flesh and actually red blood cells that have been found. Of course, one of the most famous ones is a T-Rex, still with sinew and muscles and so forth, things like that. And then there's a 38-foot tree fossil in Lancashire, England, that is, again, straight up. And some of these are some of the pictures of those captured in strata. And again, keep in mind, all these layers are supposed to be separated by millions and millions of years, and yet it's just standing there. Both of these are fossilized trees. This one is in Tennessee. The other one is in Nova Scotia. So we've got multiple examples of out-of-place fossils. I thought this was pretty cool. You have someone, it's not a footprint, it's a sandal print that is supposedly 500 million years old. Okay? Well, how do you try to figure out that? Because the sandal print right here, there's supposed to be what's supposed to be a 500 million year old trilobite, and this is kind of a blown up section of it, in the heel of this sandal. Now, it was squished when that person walked on it, which means it wasn't a fossil when the person walked on it. It was squished into it, and then that was kind of just laid there. So you got to figure if that trilobite is 500 million years old, Occam's razor suggests what? That heel would have to be 500 million years old. Obviously, that can't be the case, but that is kind of the problem you deal with some of these out-of-place fossils. It goes on to describe something that we've already talked about a little bit, how that carbon-14 is found where it should not exist. Carbon-14 max should only be able to be detected within stones, within bones, things like that, or fossils for 40,000 years tops. And yet they find it in diamonds. Some of these diamonds are 6.5 billion years old, dated so, meaning they supposedly existed before the Earth did. You have carbon-14 in fossils, carbon-14 in coal. And then he talks about how the moon, because of the pace at which the moon is expanding its orbit from the Earth, it should be at least 3.5 times further away from the Earth if the Earth were 4.5 billion years old. Remember, we talked a little bit about that a couple chapters ago, and the pace that it's expanding the distance in its orbit. We talked about the salinity of the ocean. Salinity is the salt content or the sodium content in the oceans. It should be 80 times greater, and it's not. In fact, this one doctor, Dr. Greger, in 1988 said salt must somehow be leaving the ocean. We just don't know how it's happening. So there has to be a reason. We just can't understand how that's happening, but it has to be, because if our math is right and our science is right, there should be 80 times more salt in the oceans than what there currently is, which I think is hilarious. Ocean sediment, talk about ocean sediment. In fact, what's really interesting about that, just within the last, based upon their math, again, uniformitarianism, you think about, and I love looking at photos and watching videos of the Titanic wreck, okay, in the Atlantic Ocean, and how that it's just laying there on the bottom of the ocean floor. And there's some sediment and buildup of things and so forth, but not nearly what there should be. It should be at least halfway buried based on the math that they've established for how much sediment should be delivered in the oceans over time. And yet the Titanic is still pretty much exactly the same as it was when it was found. What was it, back in 84? I think it was the year I was born, so about 30, 40 years ago. I wish it was 30, 40 years ago. Talked about Grand Canyon, how that it's actually missing, not 4.5 cubic, I think it's cubic million, 5.45 million cubic yards of material. It has to be somewhere. Okay, all this material that supposedly was gradually created over time, all this material had to go somewhere, but they have no idea where it could have possibly gone. It's missing. Okay, well, again, it goes back to that same thing. It must have left somewhere, we just don't know where. He talked about comets and how because of the composition of certain comets that exist, especially some of these balls of ice and things like that, based on what are supposed to be their continual orbits in our solar system, they shouldn't exist at this point. Okay, if these things have existed since, quote unquote, the creation of the solar system, which would have been, 8 billion years ago or 7 billion years ago or so, then these things would have long been extinguished, long time ago. There's, in fact, through science fiction and TV shows and things like that, there's always talk about the Oort cloud. Now, there's an asteroid belt between, there's a smaller asteroid belt between Mars going out, okay, but there's supposed to be a further out, outside of our solar system, there's supposed to be what's called the Oort cloud, which is, again, balls of ice, balls of rock, kind of a huge field of asteroids that should exist, at least according to their theories, yet no evidence has been found. In fact, Carl Sagan in 1997 specifically points that out. He says that everybody keeps talking about what's supposedly the Oort cloud and how these comets and things, they must be coming from the Oort cloud. That has to explain why it took them this many millions of years to get to the solar system, or to Earth for us to see and that sort of thing. But Carl Sagan says there is no evidence at all. Nothing has been found to say that what's called the Oort cloud even exists. And as we go through, gradually, evolutionists are beginning to reject uniformitarianism in favor of what they call neo-catastrophism. It's not that catastrophism formed all this stuff over the course of 7,000 years with a great big flood that took place at one point, but rather they still look at the billions of years old of the Earth, but individual localized catastrophes may have helped create these things. And so they're having to treat these one-offs and these things that are kind of, we don't have an explanation for that. Well, it must have been a localized catastrophe.
So, yeah, they have to have some faith.
Yeah.
Because our faith is proven, there's evidence of the Bible's truth.
Yeah.
And that they happen. And if they don't get the answer, they just...
Well, and that goes back to, usually people who believe in the Bible, their faith is referred to as a blind faith. Our faith, is it blind though?
No, it's not.
Exactly. And so I would actually argue that this is the blind faith, because they have a preconceived narrative that they're then trying to fit all the facts within that narrative. Whereas we as Christians, we base our faith not on the word or testimony of one person, not on the word or testimony of even 10 people, but 40 plus people throughout 66 books in 1,400 years, all saying the same thing. Now, that's, for any court of law, would that testimony, if it were anything else other than the Bible, would that stand up? Absolutely. In fact, far less is used to determine ancient history. Okay, the Augustus Caesar and all these different individuals who, Julius Caesar and so forth, who existed, back in the 2,000 years ago and so forth, they base their knowledge of these individuals based on very few ancient texts and manuscripts. And yet they take it as gospel. Yet the Bible is rejected because it describes things that they can't believe. All right, anything else through that?
They do accept the miraculous nature.
The miracles, the supernatural element to it.
They have to accept some miracles too.
Oh, man, yeah.
Yeah, because they have to accept that something came from nothing.
Something came from nothing.
That
Yep.
life came from non-life.
Yeah.
They've got all these things they've got to believe
Absolutely. And they have no mechanism to explain it. We have a mechanism. Our mechanism is the power of God. That's the mechanism we believe in. And is that power limited in any way? No. God could snap his fingers and all of this could exist. And that's not a problem for one who believes in God. Yes, ma'am. Okay. All right. Let's cover our questions real quick. Some of these are kind of tricky. Kind of had to pay attention to some of these specific references that Josh makes in the chapter. For the multiple choice, question 1. Examples of rapid sedimentation in the geologic column include, which ones are included? A and B. Yeah, A and B are the ones specifically. In fact, C and D are specifically contrary to that. That's what you don't find, that you should find if uniformitarianism is correct. Question 2, examples of polystrate fossils. Those are fossils that are contained within multiple strata or multiple millions of years. Include what? All of them. A, B, C, and D. Question 3, examples of out-of-place fossils include A, B, C, and D. Okay, all of them as well. Number 4, catastrophism can account for the following geologic findings. A, B, and C. Yeah, the Suez Canal was not mentioned in the text because the Suez Canal was what? Man-made. Number 5, examples of universities that before 1800 taught that catastrophism accounted for the geologic column include which ones? Okay. A. Huh? Yeah, A, B, C, and D. A, B, and C, I think. I don't think Cambridge. Is Cambridge in there? I didn't check that. I saw UC Berkeley definitely wasn't. That's on page, well, that's on the first page, isn't it?
Page 102.
Second page, or fourth page, whatever.
Yeah.
Yep, Cambridge as well. Yep, you're right, A, B, C, and D. Question 6, examples of evidence for a young Earth include? A, B, and C. Yep. The deficit of helium in our atmosphere was not discussed in the chapter. That has been one thing that has been debated in terms of the helium in the atmosphere and whether that proves anything, but that was not a part of the chapter. All right. Matching. Number 1, as natural events gradually transpire now, naturally occurring events have always gradually taken place in the past. Okay, D, that is the doctrine of uniformitarianism. Number 2, all the fountains of the great deep are broken up. A, Genesis 7:11. Number 3, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? B, Job 38. Number 4, for since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. 2 Peter, that's C, yep, 2 Peter 3. Number 5, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, let the dry land appear. I'm sorry. I think, yeah. So that'd be E. Yeah. I accidentally put A on my thing, but it's E.
You're wrong.
Or I'm sorry, F. I apologize. F. Number 6, the men who influenced Charles Darwin's thinking regarding uniformitarianism. G. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't even realize that Josh threw in an extra Genesis reference just to throw everybody off. How about that? Tricky, tricky. Didn't even catch that. All right, true or false? We can kind of just jump to the conclusion here. All of them have the same answer.
False.
False. 10,000 year age for our planet. It's called the Old Earth view. Nope, that's false. If the Great Noahic Flood had actually occurred, all types, kinds, sizes of life forms would be interspersed throughout the geologic column. That's false. The fact they've shown evidence, they've done tests and shows it would all be on the same layer. Number three, if Great Noahic Flood had actually occurred, we would not find similar layers of sedimentation in various parts of the world. That's false. Number four, the age of the earth is not relevant to the study of evolution. False. The Bible gives no indication as to what might have caused the geologic column. False. And then Adam and Eve and all life forms are physically immature on the day that God created them. False. All right. Go into lesson 12, the origin of man. And there's a really good, in the appendices, there is one really good article describing, and we may have time to talk about that at some point. By the way, including tonight, we have 3 Wednesday nights left, and we've only got, including chapter 12 here, 2 lessons left. So we might actually have a little bit of time to cover some of the appendices. But talking about the origin of man, one of the first things that Josh talks about is, well, where's the evidence? This goes a little bit to some of the comments that we've been getting. In fact, one of the latest comments talks about there are thousands and thousands of transitional fossils. You refuse to accept it. The transitional fossils that are often purported as being, oh, this proves macroevolution, aren't transitional fossils showing one kind turning into a different kind. They are subspecies. Okay, so for instance, is the skeleton or the fossil of a cat and a lion evidence of macroevolution? They're the same kind. They're feline. Okay, you're talking about variations of subspecies, variation within a kind. So you're not talking about a gradual change from one species' entire genus into a whole new thing, like, for instance, apes and human beings. You're talking about, and those transitional fossils that they assign to it, most of those, they're just subspecies. That's nothing that you and I deny. Okay, God even establishes that there are subspecies all the way through from Old Testament into New Testament. You see that being shown, these different, some of the things that we're used to and we're familiar with that didn't exist, in Jesus' time. Even the domesticated cats, the Egyptians had those way back thousands of years ago. Okay, so there have been subspecies of these all along. That doesn't prove anything. And a lot of these are also, they're based on single or fragmentary fossils. The way sometimes scientific articles and things propose these, it's as if they have the whole skeleton. Very rarely do you find an entire skeleton complete with every bone in it. Now, some cases we do. Some of these, like this whale that was buried full size and everything. Some dinosaur bones, we find almost entire skeletons or half skeletons, but especially what's referred to as transitional fossils are based upon usually just single or even just pieces of fossils, not entire skeletons. Then you have this whole narrative that then builds up out of this because it's not the exact same shape as our pinky bone today. So this must represent a whole new species or subspecies of human. And that's not the case. Many atheistic evolutionists admit, and this is one of the key components of this, is that a lot of the people who comment on the videos and so forth, they're coming at it from the perspective that the atheistic evolutionist community are all on the same page here. And that's not true. Okay, there are atheistic evolutionists. We're not talking about creationists. We're not talking about people who believe in God. There are atheistic evolutionists who admit that there is no true transitional evidence. And in fact, they wish there were. And yet every single one of them that has been purported and brought out as transitional and everybody starts waving the flag, woohoo, we found it, has been disproven. And so, or major issues are with it. And so it's not considered a true evolutionary or true transitional between times fossil. And this is one of the things that we'll talk about as well. This is Dr. Gee. There's a lot of references and quotes to Dr. Gee, he's an evolutionary paleontologist. He was the chief science writer for Nature magazine or Nature journal. And he says to take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. This is not, nothing in here suggests that he believes in God, that he's a creationist. He is an evolutionary paleontologist. So that would suggest that he doesn't believe in creation. He doesn't believe in necessarily God. And if he does, it's one of those versions of what we talked about a couple chapters ago, talking about the long age belief of creation, things like that. And he also goes on to say that fossil evidence of chimpanzee evolution is absent altogether. There is absolutely no evidence that chimpanzees evolved from anything. They just appeared. So that's, to me, that's very interesting, that you have all these lineages and so forth supposedly of man, but there's absolutely none of chimpanzees, which supposedly evolved or diverged off of the same branch that man did. And if anything, there should be more fossils of chimpanzees than others. This is what we're familiar with. We're familiar with this particular picture that's often promoted as being kind of the evolution of man. You start off with this ape. Now, again, one of the things that they've been trying to kind of retcon a little bit and say, well, yes, but somewhere in here there was a divergence, because creationists are like, well, why do we still have apes? Why do we still have chimpanzees and different kinds of monkeys and things like that? So you have this tree that produced man, then you have this other tree that produced apes and chimpanzees and all this other stuff. Yet there's no evidence of any of that. In fact, Dr. Gee, again, this time in 2011, he says, we know that as a depiction of evolution, this lineup, he's talking about this type of picture, is tosh, or it's baloney. Yet we cling to it. Dart's original paper, this Dr. Dart, he talked about A. africanus and the supposed skeleton that they found supposedly being an ancient ancestor of mankind. It was long on waffle and short on substance. I think that's really indicative of the state of evolutionary evidence, given that this man Gee is a evolutionary paleontologist. And then this is talking about Dr. Landau. This is on page 114. But Josh mentions how Dr. Landau in 1991, she wrote a book, and she was going through kind of the I guess you could say, the case for man and being evolved from a primitive ancestor and so forth, and what the evidence for it was. Again, she is an evolutionist. She's not a creationist of any kind. But she says the four main events are repeated throughout these narratives. Human ancestors move from living in trees to living on the ground. They develop an upright standing posture. Then they acquire intelligence and language. And then finally, they develop technology and society. These are assumptions made with no scientific substantiation. This is taught all the time, and this kind of timeline or this narrative is carried through to a lot of different fields and facets when we just in TV shows and even news segments and things like that. This is the type of timeline that is assumed, and there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever. And then in the August 23rd, 1999 issue of Time magazine, this is what they said, and I think this is amazing. Talking about common ancestor and talking about the lineage of man and so forth. No fossils found yet. Now, keep in mind, supposedly we found thousands of transitional fossils that prove, and of those thousands, I don't know how many are attributed to from ape to man, but supposedly we have all these transitional fossils, and yet Time magazine itself said we haven't found any. But scientists believe that human and ape lines diverged, and so that's supposed to explain creationists have failed to understand this point and thus have misguidedly questioned why there are no half men, half apes still evolving today. So, like I said, they kind of retcon the idea of ape to human. Now they've got some ancient ancestor of apes and humans that evolved, and then split, and then you had humans, and then you had all these subspecies of apes. Now, supposedly, what's interesting to me is you still have subspecies of apes. Okay, we have all kinds of different apes, all kinds of different, variation of apes, some small, some big, right? Do we have multiple subspecies of human? Now, we have variation of human. Do we have multiple subspecies of human? No. Supposedly, Homo sapien was, not Homo sapien, Homo sapiens us. Neanderthal, and I think there's a new one, it starts with a Debian, something along that line. Anyways, there's these different supposedly precursors to humanity, and then the Neanderthals died out, and then Homo sapiens took over. But it's not like the apes and the monkeys and all that, like there's just one type of monkey with just, different variation. You have subspecies of monkey. You have different types of monkeys. They're all one kind, but all different variations. And so it seems to me that if that were the case, we should have multiple subspecies of humans today. Okay, we should have, what are those hobbits, okay, from Lord of the Rings? We should have hobbits. Okay, we have dwarfism, we have little people, but hobbits are completely different. Okay, or elves, or kind of Spock-like pointed ears. We should have all kinds of different variations of human beings that have enhanced hearing over Homo sapien or whatever. We don't. It's just us. We're it. Why is that? And I'm sure they would come up with some answer. Well, we killed all of them. Okay, yeah, there would have been, but then they were different, so we just killed them, so they didn't evolve. I don't know. But to me, that's kind of weird. Saw a hand somewhere. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, the line in that kind of cracks me up is, creationists have often failed, so we're not smart enough to understand the point that there wouldn't be half men, half animals. They just diverse,
Right.
swing different directions.
Right.
So the reason that's not taken on is because it is restricted to understanding.
Right. Yep. All right. That's where we'll stop. Next week, we'll start with page 115. We're going to examine the fossil evidence of ape/man and kind of look at some of the supposed evidence for what this is purporting. And then we'll move on to the questions and hopefully, Lord willing, get into lesson 13 as well. Thank you, everybody.